There's something about Louisiana's forests that doesn't sit right when the sun goes down. It's not the animals, not the coyotes or the owls. It's something quieter, like the woods themselves are waiting for you to stop breathing, just so they can listen. A man once said that the Kisatchie doesn't like to be looked at after dark. He was a seasoned hunter, 40 years in those woods, never lost, never scared. Until one night in late October, when his truck broke down 20 miles from the nearest road. He called it the longest night of his life. He had enough fuel to keep the headlights running, so he stayed put, hoping the glow would keep the wild things away. But around midnight, something started pacing just outside the light. He said it moved slow, too slow, like it wanted him to notice. He fired a warning shot, but the sound didn't echo. It was as if the trees swallowed it whole. The pacing stopped, and then came the sound of his own voice. Not an echo, not a recording. His own voice, calling back to him from the darkness. Come out. The road's clear now. He froze. He said it sounded perfect. Every breath, every tone. But it came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that didn't feel real. So we waited until dawn, rifle ready, eyes locked on the tree line. When the first light hit, there were no footprints, no animal tracks, nothing disturbed at all. But his headlights were shattered from the inside. Locals found the truck 2 days later, doors open, engine off, battery dead. The hunter was never found. And that's when the warnings began. Stay away from Kisatchie after dark. They say the forest doesn't take kindly to strangers anymore. Some call it superstition. Others say the forest remembers. What exactly is happening in Louisiana's only national forest? And why are even the rangers refusing to talk about it? Tonight, we're going deep into Kisatchie to uncover the truth behind the warnings. If you pull up a map of Louisiana, you'll find a stretch of green that cuts through the heart of the state. Over 500,000 acres of wilderness. That's Kisatchie National Forest, the only national forest in all of Louisiana. It's divided into 5 main districts: Calcasieu, Caney, Catahoula, Evangeline, and Wynne. Each one a maze of pine ridges, hidden bayous, and forgotten roads that date back to before the Civil War. On paper, it's a place for hiking, camping, and peace. But talk to the people who live near it, and you'll get a different story entirely. They'll tell you that strange lights move through the treetops at night, that the air can shift from warm to freezing in seconds, and that sometimes even seasoned locals lose their sense of direction, like the forest rearranges itself when no one's looking. It's easy to dismiss that kind of talk as folklore. Louisiana has no shortage of ghost stories after all. But Kisatchie is different. The forest has a reputation, not just among locals, but among rangers, rescue workers, and law enforcement. Over the years, quiet reports have circulated about unexplained disappearances, mutilated wildlife, and sections of land abruptly marked restricted without public reason. There's even a stretch locals call the corridor. It's not on official maps, just a dirt trail that cuts through the Wynne district, where compasses fail and GPS devices drain within minutes. People who've tried to map it say it doesn't end where it should. Yet despite these stories, the Kisatchie draws thousands of visitors every year. Campers, hunters, and explorers who think it's just another piece of southern wilderness. But the locals, they warn outsiders the same way they've been warning for decades. Don't go too far off the trail. Don't whistle after dark. And if the woods go quiet, don't move. The strange thing is, those warnings don't come from superstition or campfire tales. Many of them trace back to tribal legends. stories that existed long before the forest was given its modern name. According to some native accounts, these lands were once believed to be watched over or guarded by something that walked between worlds. Not a spirit, not an animal, but something in between. And if you ask the right people in the small towns bordering Kisatchie, Natchitoches, Alexandria, or Winfield, they'll tell you the same thing. People go missing out there, and no one talks about it. In this video, we're going to look deeper at the history, the accounts, and the patterns that have kept this forest surrounded by silence for nearly a century. Because sometimes, when a place carries enough stories, it stops being folklore. This is Kisatchie National Forest, and this is where the warnings begin. Long before the U.S. government ever mapped this land, or called it Kisatchie, these woods already had a name. But it wasn't one written down. The earliest inhabitants, the Caddo, the Choctaw, and the Natchez tribes, all spoke of the region in careful tones. Not fearful, respectful. The name Kisatchie itself is believed to have come from a Caddo word for long cane, referring to the tall river canes that once covered the area. But locals say there's a second meaning, one that doesn't appear in any linguistic record. They say it also referred to the place that watches. In those days, people spoke of forest keepers, entities that watch from between the trees, guiding hunters, warning them when to leave, and sometimes punishing those who didn't listen. These weren't ghost stories. They were part of the landscape's identity. Even today, elders in the region will tell you about the shifting silence, moments when the forest grows still without reason. No birds, no frogs, not even the wind. The older generations believed that was the moment the watcher arrived, and that if you made a sound, it would remember you. When settlers came in the early 1800s, they saw the forest differently, as a resource. They cleared the canebrakes, cut into the longleaf pines, and built mills by the streams. Many of them vanished in ways that didn't make sense. The stories were brushed off as wilderness hazards, wildcats, bears, bad weather. But the people who lived there didn't think so. They believed something ancient had been disturbed. By the early 1900s, the U.S. government began acquiring the land that would later become Kisatchie National Forest. At first, it was an act of conservation, replanting longleaf pines, restoring the ecosystem. But that wasn't the whole story. During World War II, parts of the forest were converted into military training zones, including Camp Polk and Pheasant Ridge. Old maps show vast areas marked restricted, with barbed fencing and access roads that led nowhere. Officially, these were for training exercises. Unofficially, locals tell a different version. They remember convoys entering the forest and never coming out for days, helicopters circling at night, strange lights in the treetops long after the war ended. And here's where it gets interesting. When the military left, those fenced areas stayed sealed. Some were handed back to the Forest Service, others weren't. And to this day, a few of those sites remain off limits to the public, labeled simply as environmental restoration zones. What's being restored has never been publicly clarified. In the decades that followed, the forest became a patchwork of hunting grounds, logging regions, and protected zones. But behind that management plan, strange things kept surfacing. In the local papers, in police reports, in whispered stories traded over campfires, people began to notice patterns, hunters missing in areas near old military sites, campers hearing radio chatter through the trees when no one else was around. A series of disappearances between 1979 and 1983 drew quiet attention. 6 people in total, all last seen near the Evangeline and Wynn districts. The official cause of death in most cases was environmental exposure. But what stood out were the search reports. Dogs refusing to track. Rescue teams claiming to hear names being called from opposite directions. Some of those rescue workers quit shortly after. None of them ever gave interviews. One of the old rangers interviewed years later said this: "Kisatchie doesn't forget. When you stay too long, it knows your name." Whether he meant that literally or not, no one can say, but it's a phrase that shows up more than once in ranger logs from the 1980s, scratched into notebooks, left unsigned. So the question becomes, what exactly is the forest remembering? Is it something tied to the land's oldest stories, the watchers of the tribes, or something newer? Something that arrived when man first fenced off the trees and called it preserved. Whatever the answer, it's buried somewhere in Kisatchie's past, and that's where the stories begin to turn from legend into evidence. In the next part, we'll hear from those who claim to have seen or heard what still moves within these woods. If you ask around in the small towns bordering Kisatchie, places like Natchitoches, Dry Prong, or Provençal, you'll find that the stories always start the same way. Someone goes missing. Someone else sees something they can't explain. And then, everyone stops talking about it. Not out of fear, more like respect. A quiet agreement that some things just don't need to be repeated. But a few people still talk, and their stories line up in ways that are hard to ignore. The first story comes from a retired park worker named Earl Jenkins, now in his 70s. He spent nearly 20 years maintaining trails in the Wynn district, one of the thickest, most isolated parts of the forest. Earl said there was a stretch of trail near an old service road that no one liked taking. It wasn't marked on official maps, but he called it the Hollow Path. He said it always felt like the air was heavier there, like something in the trees was watching. One morning in 1998, he was out there alone, checking fire markers. The woods were silent. Not a single bird. No wind. Just the sound of his own boots crunching the leaves. He stopped for lunch near a clearing, a place he'd been to dozens of times before. But this time, the clearing looked different. The stumps were gone. The brush was clean. And in the middle of the space, there was something carved into the dirt. A perfect circle, about 6 feet across, smoothed down as if someone had been walking it for hours. He said he thought it might have been a campfire ring, but there were no ashes, no rocks, no sign of burning, just compacted soil. He radioed it in, no response. Tried again, dead static. So he started back. That's when he heard it. The sound of footsteps, pacing just beyond the tree line, matching his stride. When he stopped, it stopped. When he moved faster, it moved faster. He said he finally broke into a run. But halfway down the trail, his radio crackled to life. Just a single voice saying, "Keep walking." Earl swore he didn't recognize the voice. When he reached his truck, his radio went dead again. He left that job 2 months later and never went back. The second account comes from 2 college students, Jenna and Marcus, who visited Kisatchie in 2016 for a photography assignment. They planned to shoot long exposure images of the night sky near the Longleaf Trail scenic byway. They parked near the overlook, set up their tripods, and waited for the stars. Around midnight, Marcus noticed a faint light moving through the woods below them. Not like a flashlight beam. It was higher, weaving slowly between the trees. At first, they thought it was another group of campers. But then, a second light appeared beside it, and both began to mimic their camera flashes, blinking in the same rhythm. They laughed at first, thinking it was coincidence, until Jenna said she could hear voices echoing up from the forest. Not words exactly, just tones that matched the rhythm of their shutters clicking. Within minutes, Marcus's camera stopped working. Battery dead. His phone too. But Jenna's camera, the one that kept running, caught something in the background of her final shot. A shape standing just beyond the trees. Tall, human-like, but not fully formed. Almost mirrored, as if it was reflecting the forest itself. The photo's metadata showed it was taken at 12:07 a.m., but when they checked their watches, it was 11:46. Something had thrown the timestamp off by 21 minutes. They left that night, abandoning most of their gear. When they returned the next morning, the overlook was empty, except for one of their tripods, bent in half. Then there's Deputy Harold LeBlanc, who worked in Rapides Parish in the late 90s. He responded to what was reported as a missing hunter near the Evangeline unit. The man had gone out tracking feral hogs and hadn't checked in for 2 days. When they found his camp, his gear was still there, untouched. The fire was out. His rifle leaned against a tree, and his footprints led out about 50 yards before disappearing entirely. No drag marks, no blood, just clean soil, like the earth had been pressed flat by something smooth. LeBlanc said that night, as they were packing up, one of his team members wandered off to relieve himself. When he came back, he looked pale. Said he'd heard someone whisper his name right beside his ear. They assumed it was a prank until they noticed his radio was still on, and they heard the whisper again. But this time, it said someone else's name. They shut down the search an hour later, citing poor weather conditions. But LeBlanc admitted off record, he'd never felt more watched in his life. The strange thing about all these accounts isn't just the fear, it's the consistency. They all describe silence that comes before something happens. They all describe different people, different decades, different districts, yet the same detail repeats. Someone, or something, in Kisatchie calls you by your name. Whether it's an echo, a mimic, or something older than either. No one's been able to explain. But every ranger, deputy, and hunter who's worked these woods long enough eventually says the same thing. The forest remembers. In the next part, we'll look at what the explanations might be. Because while some say it's myth, others believe there's a reason behind these patterns. And it might not be supernatural at all. When you start asking around about Kisatchie, you'll notice something. People hesitate before answering. The older locals, the ones who've lived on the outskirts their whole lives, will glance around before they speak, like they're checking who might be listening. And if you're persistent enough, a few will tell you stories they swear are true. The first comes from a hunter named Thomas, a retired game warden who's lived near the Calcasieu district since the 1980s. He told me he'd spent half his life tracking animals through that forest, but what he saw one morning in 1994 didn't fit any known pattern. I was tracking deer about 4 miles off the main trail, he said. It was right around dawn. Everything felt normal until it didn't. The woods got quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. I thought maybe a cougar was nearby, but then I noticed every tree around me was marked. Not like claw marks. These were cuts, clean, straight lines, in groups of 3, chest height, every 15 feet, same spacing. Thomas said the air grew heavier, and the forest, which he knew like the back of his hand, started to feel different. It was like walking through a loop. I'd swear I was moving forward, but the same fallen log kept showing up ahead of me. I finally turned back, but the trail was gone. The undergrowth didn't look right. It took me almost 3 hours to find my way back to my truck, and my GPS, the one I'd just replaced, was completely dead. He went back the next day with 2 other wardens. The marks were gone. Every single one. I don't care who believes me, Thomas said, but I'll never step past those ridges again. The second account came from a hiker named Renee, a young woman who visited Kisatchie with her boyfriend in 2011. They were camping in the Catahoula district, one of the quieter zones, when something woke them in the middle of the night. It was this low hum, she said, not like an animal or a generator. It was deeper, like it was vibrating through the ground. They stepped out of their tent and saw faint lights flickering between the trees, bluish white, moving in a slow pattern. She thought it was other campers at first, but when she called out, the lights stopped. Then the forest went dead silent. Her boyfriend grabbed his flashlight and aimed it toward the ridgeline. That's when they saw it. A tall figure, standing still. Too still. No sound, no breathing, no eye reflection. Just a shape, darker than the darkness itself. They packed up what they could and left before sunrise. When they came back the next afternoon with a ranger, their campsite was untouched, except for one thing. The soil under their tent, compacted, smooth the night before, had been disturbed, like something had been crawling beneath it. The ranger didn't write anything down, Renee said. He just told us not to camp there again. Said we weren't the first to see those lights. And then there's the one story locals always come back to, the Winfield disappearances. Between 1978 and 1981, at least 7 hikers and 2 hunters vanished in the Wynn district. None of their remains were ever found, and the cases were quietly classified as environmental misadventure. But one name, David Lenore, a 34-year-old surveyor, stands out. His compass readings from that day were recorded by his employer, showing a phenomenon investigators couldn't explain. The direction readings flipped back and forth repeatedly, north to south, south to north, while the GPS coordinates remained stationary. To this day, that log remains in the Calcasieu Ranger Station archive, and no one's been able to reproduce it. Something interfered with his equipment, said a retired ranger who requested anonymity. We don't talk about it publicly, but everyone who's worked that district knows. Certain areas play tricks on your instruments. and sometimes on your head. These aren't stories from campfire storytellers or online forums. These are recorded accounts from people with names, jobs, and credibility, all describing the same pattern: silence, distortion, and something in the forest that doesn't want to be found. And if these witnesses are to be believed, whatever is hiding in Kisatchie doesn't just move through the woods, it watches them back. When you start looking into the records surrounding Kisatchie National Forest, one thing becomes immediately clear. There isn't much to find. Despite decades of strange disappearances, ranger reports, and witness statements, official documentation is nearly non-existent. The National Forest Service archives for Louisiana contain only a handful of incident summaries, and most of them read like carbon copies. Hiker failed to return. Search concluded. No evidence of foul play. That's it. No follow-up, no secondary investigation, and in most cases, no public record of who led the search teams. It's almost like the forest was allowed to write its own conclusions. I spoke with a retired Forest Service ranger who agreed to comment anonymously. He served in the Evangeline and Wynn districts through the 1990s, and according to him, the silence isn't an accident. We were told not to document certain things, he said. If someone went missing and there were unexplained signs, like strange tracks or compass anomalies, we were instructed to leave those details out of the report. They'd tell us, "Don't add confusion to the file." That was the phrase. When I asked what confusion meant, he paused for a long time. It meant anything that couldn't be explained by normal means. Anything that might attract media attention or spark outside investigations. We were supposed to protect the forest's image, not the people in it. That might sound extreme, but there's precedent. In the late 1980s, internal memos from the U.S. Forest Service revealed similar censorship across other national forests. Reports of unverified biological sightings in Oregon, Washington, and Arkansas were quietly filtered out of public logs. The reasoning? Tourism protection. A sudden drop in visitation meant a loss in local revenue, and in towns surrounding Kisatchie, that money kept small businesses alive. So, when disappearances or strange encounters happened, they were framed as hiker error or environmental hazards. But according to locals, the truth went deeper than economics. One man, a volunteer on a 2005 search operation, described something he wasn't supposed to see. "We were combing an area north of Caney Lake," he said. "The dogs picked up a scent, but the supervisors called us back halfway through. No explanation. Later that day, I saw 3 unmarked trucks pull into the restricted zone. No Forest Service logos, no plates. Just plain white trucks. They stayed out there until dusk. We were told to go home and not speak about it." No record of that search exists in the 2005 Forest Service report. Even the incident number, typically logged for every official search, is missing. If something was found, the volunteer said, it never made it to the public report. Over the years, several rangers have resigned without explanation. Locals in Natchitoches Parish still talk about a ranger named Lewis Harper, who left his post in 2013 after reporting severe psychological distress during a patrol in the Wynn district. Harper's medical notes, obtained through a public records request, describe persistent nightmares, auditory hallucinations, and an unshakable feeling of being watched in the field. His resignation was approved in under 48 hours. No follow-up investigation was conducted. For most people, all of this might sound like fragments of rumor, disconnected stories that only seem related when stitched together. But once you notice the pattern, the lack of files, the redacted reports, the sudden reassignments, you realize something. Kisatchie isn't just a forest that hides people. It's a forest that hides the truth. And whatever that truth is, it's buried under layers of silence. Official, deliberate, and decades deep. Coming up next, the folklore connection. How native legends of the region may not just explain what's happening in Kisatchie, but why it refuses to be exposed. Because some stories weren't meant to be found.
Long before it was called Kisatchie, before the boundaries were drawn and the logging roads carved through its pines, this land had another name. To the tribes that once called this part of Louisiana home, the Caddo, the Choctaw, and later the Adai, the region was known as the place where the voices move through trees. The stories say those voices weren't wind or spirits, but something older, something that moved between the roots and shadows. An elder from the Adai Caddo Nation once told an anthropologist in the 1930s that the forest was alive in a way people couldn't understand. He said there were keepers beneath the soil, watchers of the land who punished those who entered without respect. If you hear the woods breathing, he said, you have already been seen. Back then, stories like that were dismissed as folklore, cultural poetry to explain the unknown. But the locations described in those oral traditions match several of the modern problem zones within Kisatchie. Areas where compasses fail, hikers vanish, and the ground itself seems unstable. One Choctaw legend speaks of Nane Ishtaya, translated loosely as the one with borrowed skin. It's said to appear as a person familiar to you, a loved one, a hunter, even another traveler. But its voice never matches. Its eyes are always too dark, and it leads those who follow it deeper into the woods, never to return. The elders believed this being wasn't evil in the way people think of monsters. It was a test. A guardian meant to keep the sacred places untouched by outsiders. And the punishment for crossing into those places without permission was to be taken by the forest itself. When modern historians compared these stories to colonial journals from the 1700s, they found something remarkable. French trappers had recorded their own experiences of being followed by the talking shadows in the very same region. In one account, dated 1762, a man named Luc Morel wrote that he and his partner heard human voices whispering their names, though they were alone for miles. The next morning, his partner's footprints led straight into a shallow bayou and stopped halfway across. No body was ever found. Even today, native communities near Kisatchie still warn against entering certain zones after dark. They say some areas belong to the ones who never left. It's not about spirits or demons or monsters. It's about memory, the kind that refuses to fade, no matter how many maps are drawn or roads are built. When people go missing, said one Adai elder, it's not because the forest took them. It's because they didn't listen. And when you line up the tribal warnings, the ranger accounts, and the missing persons data, you start to see the pattern forming in plain sight. Kisatchie isn't haunted, it's guarded, and those who've gone too deep might have stepped into places that were never meant to be found again. In the next part, we'll look at the modern evidence, the geological anomalies, the EM interference, and the satellite scans that may finally explain what's happening beneath Kisatchie's soil, or prove that something much stranger is at play. Because if the legends are true, the forest doesn't just watch, it remembers. Legends and testimonies can be dismissed, but what about the data?
In 2016, a small team of graduate researchers from Louisiana State University's Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences conducted a field study across Kisatchie's Wynn and Calcasieu districts. Their goal was simple: to chart subsurface magnetic variations linked to old mineral veins and rock structures beneath the forest. What they found didn't match anything on record. According to their published field notes, nearly 1/3 of the sampling locations produced magnetic fluctuations up to 40 times higher than expected, with no visible source. No metallic deposits, no fault lines, no environmental interference. When they compared those results against U.S. Geological Survey maps, they discovered something even stranger. The magnetic hot zones aligned almost perfectly with the same regions locals claim are unsafe, areas associated with compasses failing and unexplained disappearances. Around that same time, a separate independent group of paranormal researchers, not ghost hunters but electromagnetic analysts, recorded a continuous frequency pulse around 17 Hz in the forest interior. That frequency sits within what's called the infrasound range, low enough to be felt in the body, but not heard by the ear. Studies by NASA and the European Space Agency have shown that sustained exposure to infrasound can trigger anxiety, disorientation, nausea, and even hallucinations in sensitive individuals. So what if part of the Kisatchie phenomenon isn't supernatural at all, but geophysical? What if the land itself hums with something that distorts perception? A kind of natural interference that blurs the line between the real and the imagined. Then there's the satellite data. In 2020, high-resolution LiDAR scans from a forestry management project revealed several unnatural clearings deep within the Wynn district. Perfect circular gaps where the vegetation density abruptly drops to zero. No roads lead there. No logging permits exist for those sites. And the shapes, spanning between 60 and 100 feet in diameter, appear to shift slightly in location between satellite captures, as if the land beneath them was moving. When journalists from a Baton Rouge Environmental Review requested access to those coordinates, their inquiry was denied for ecological safety reasons. But a leaked internal memo from the same office referenced a phrase repeated several times: geothermal anomalies, unstable readings, field access restricted. One hypothesis suggests that pockets of magnetite, an iron oxide mineral with strong magnetic properties, could be causing those readings. But there's a problem. Louisiana's known magnetite deposits are concentrated in the northern hills, not in the central and southern portions where these anomalies are appearing. In other words, something beneath Kisatchie is generating magnetic and thermal irregularities where no known geological process should. And it's not just scientific instruments reacting strangely out there. Radio operators along the forest's edge report shortwave interference that pulses in predictable cycles, exactly 14 minutes apart. No civilian or government frequency matches that pattern, yet it's been detected consistently for years. It's like the ground itself is transmitting,
said a local ham operator from Natchitoches Parish. But the moment you try to track it, it vanishes. Combine the electromagnetic field data, the infrasound frequencies, the temperature fluctuations, and the lack of geological cause, and you start to see a profile emerging, a living environment that seems to react to human presence, a forest that distorts technology, perception, and navigation in measurable, reproducible ways, which raises the question: are these phenomena the byproduct of an unknown natural process, or are they symptoms of something that predates human understanding entirely? The further you dig into the data, the more it feels like something intelligent is embedded in the landscape itself, not sentient in the way we understand, but organized, deliberate, aware. And maybe that's what the old stories were trying to warn us about all along. In the next section, we turn to pattern recognition and correlation, where missing persons timelines, environmental data, and eyewitness accounts begin to overlap so precisely that coincidence no longer seems like an option. Because if all of this connects, then Kisachi isn't an accident of nature. It's a design.
They say the Kisachi National Forest is just trees, trails, and swamp air. But if you talk to the right people, locals, hunters, rangers who stayed past dusk, you'll hear something different. They'll tell you the forest listens. You can walk for hours in there and never hear another human voice, yet somehow you'll feel like you're being followed. You'll catch soft footfalls behind you, too light to be a person, too deliberate to be an animal. And if you make the mistake of calling out, the woods answer. Not with an echo, but with your own voice, mimicked back through the trees. Most dismiss it as wind or paranoia, but those who've spent their lives near Kisachi, especially the old Cajun and native families who've hunted its lowlands for generations, say there's something ancient in those woods, something that doesn't like to be disturbed. And if you ignore the warnings, if you keep walking after sunset when the forest goes silent, you might see what they mean. Not a creature, not a person, but a shape standing between the trees where no shadow should be.